Drink this.
Thank you.
It's okay now.
Chapter 1. The Girl at Dock 47. On the outer edge of the Broscow Belt, where forgotten stations drifted between freight lanes and the rich worlds pretended not to see what happened in their shadow, there hung an old orbital platform called Port Serevan. Once, long before the trade wars rerouted the big corporations and the military contracts dried up, Serevan had been a proud hub of traffic and engineering, a place where refinery barges lined up 3 deep and captains cursed over docking fees in a dozen languages. Now it lived on because decay, like desperation, could become its own economy. Half the station lights flickered on unreliable power. 3 of the 6 ring sections were sealed due to hull fractures nobody intended to repair. Air in the lower decks always smelled faintly of coolant, old smoke, and the metallic taste of recyclers working far past their dignified lifespan. Yet ships still came, because there were always cargoes too questionable for the clean ports, crews too broke for the legal ones, and people with nowhere left to go except places that no longer deserved the word civilized. In that kind of station, futures did not end all at once. They were worn down through rent notices, denied permits, failed contracts, and quiet days in which nobody called your name because nobody needed what you could still offer. Lyra had learned that lesson young enough to hate herself for having learned it at all. She belonged to the Veil, a slight, silver-skinned species from a once beautiful moon called Hishara, famous in travel catalogs generations ago for floating glass forests and luminous tidal gardens. But tourism leaves faster than war does, and Hishara had not survived the syndicate conflict that turned half its skyports to ash. Lyra had been 9 standard years old when the orbital elevators fell. She remembered almost nothing of the bombardment itself, only the scream of structural alarms, her mother pushing her under a transit bench, and later the impossible silence of refugee processing halls where every adult spoke in the calm, flat voice of people too frightened to cry in front of children. Her father never came back from the emergency lift cruise. Her mother lasted another 3 years in aid settlements before lung disease, bad filters, and exhaustion finished what war had started. After that, Lyra became what the galaxy made of orphan girls without money, titles, or useful bloodlines. Temporary labor, then informal labor, then debt labor, then unregistered survival. Port Serevan was not the first station to hold her, but it was the one that finally convinced her she had no future waiting anywhere beyond the next shift. At 19 by Veil reckoning, which made her young enough still to dream and old enough to know better, she cleaned docking bays for a subcontractor who paid in station scrip instead of credits. The scrip was only valid in 3 food stalls, 1 medicine kiosk, and a bunkhouse so crowded that privacy existed only as rumor. Her hands were always raw from solvent, and there was a scar beneath her chin from the time a cargo latch snapped and sent a crate edge into her throat. She had once tried taking night classes in navigation code through a public terminal program, but the access expired when she missed 2 shifts to care for a fever and couldn't pay the renewal. After that, she stopped pretending effort naturally led upward. Around her, Port Serevan swallowed ambitions with bureaucratic patience. Mechanics stayed mechanics until their lungs failed. Loaders got old and slower and were replaced by cousins or strangers. Girls like Lyra learned how to move through corridors without making eye contact with men who might decide loneliness looked negotiable. The hardest part was not the hunger or the fatigue. It was the spiritual erosion. The sense that if she vanished from the station one night, the port would pause only long enough to reassign her bunk and hand her mop to somebody else. Dock 47 was the worst bay on the ring, which was why Lyra was always assigned there. It handled low-fee transient traffic, salvage cutters with illegal modifications, or barges pretending not to smuggle weapons, battered courier ships whose captains either had too much pride or too little money to pay for proper maintenance. The bay's grav cranes groaned like dying animals, and one pressure seal along the eastern wall had leaked for so many months that half the deck plating carried a crust of frozen condensation. On the evening everything changed. Lyra was bent over an oil spill near the docking clamps, scraping resin-thick engine leakage from the floor, while the station announcements overhead stuttered through another list of delayed arrivals. Her back hurt. Her wrist brace had split again. She had 3 ration chits left and 6 days until pay. She remembered all these details later because ordinary misery makes the moments before miracle look especially sharp in hindsight. The arriving ship was not impressive. It was an old human courier corvette, narrow-bodied and scarred across the port flank, with a faded registry painted over twice and thruster housing patched in a color that did not match the rest of the hull. One of the landing struts hissed on descent. The dorsal plate bore the ghost of some former military designation that had been ground off, but not forgotten by metal. In another mood, Lyra might have taken private amusement in it. Human pilots, she had heard, had a habit of loving machines past the point of practicality. This one landed with all the graceless loyalty of a ship that had no business still flying and refused to discuss the matter. Dock 47 sealed, clamps engaged, and Bay Control pinged the standard service invoices that no captain ever paid without arguing. Lyra kept working. Ships came and went. Cargo shifted. Men cursed. Nothing in that pattern had ever contained her salvation before. Then the hatch opened, and the human pilot stepped down. His name, she would later learn, was Elias Vale, though in that first instant he was simply a tall human with weather-brown skin, dark hair in need of cutting, and the tired, alert posture of someone who slept in fragments rather than nights. He wore a pilot's jacket with the sleeves rolled back, utility harness strapped loose at the hips, and the expression of a man already expecting his docking fee to insult him personally. There was a scar at one eyebrow and another across the back of one hand where the skin had healed pale against the darker tone of the rest. Nothing about him announced destiny. He did not descend the ramp like a war hero, nobleman, or covert rescuer from dramatic hollow serials. He descended like a working pilot on a bad station after a long haul. Yet when his boots hit the deck, his gaze moved first to the bay controls, then to the leaking crane line overhead, then to Lyra crouched on the floor with solvent burns on her fingers, and he stopped. Lyra noticed because almost nobody ever stopped. People looked through station laborers. Around them. Past them. At best, they saw uniforms and utility tags. At worst, they saw availability. But this man, this human stranger from a rust-streaked courier ship, looked directly at her with the brief, startled concentration of someone realizing another person was there in conditions nobody should have accepted as normal. Then Dockmaster Wren, who waddled out from the service booth whenever he smelled late fees, arrived to spoil the silence. "You the captain?" he barked. "If this bucket dumped even one more liter of coolant on my deck, I'm charging leak disposal." The human glanced back at his ship. "Then your deck is about to make us both rich," he said dryly, and Lyra almost smiled before remembering she had no reason to. The exchange that followed should have been forgettable. It began as every port argument did: docking rates, clamp fees, atmospheric tax, bay maintenance surcharge, utility access deposits. Elias objected with the reflexive despair of the underfunded. Dockmaster Wren countered with the sacred greed of men who mistake local power for law. Lyra returned to scrubbing because there was safety in appearing absorbed. But partway through the argument, Wren snapped his fingers toward her without even looking. "You. Finish the deck, and then get inside the hold. Bay residue inspection." It was not technically her job, and Wren knew it. Hold inspections on transient ships often meant crawling through unsecured cargo spaces in thin gloves and bad lighting for no extra pay, sometimes while captains watched with bored indifference. Lyra stood slowly, pain pinching down her spine, and nodded because refusing dockmaster directives got labor girls blacklisted faster than theft. She took 2 steps toward the ship before the human pilot said, "No." Both Wren and Lyra looked at him. He had not raised his voice. He simply repeated, "No, my hold doesn't get searched by unpaid station cleaners because you want free labor." Wren puffed up instantly. "You want dock clearance or not?" Elias folded his arms. "I want a legal inspection team or no inspection at all." Wren snorted. "On dock 47, legal is whatever I say it is." The human's face changed slightly, then not into rage, but into the kind of cold attention that made words suddenly more expensive. "That may be how you run your booth," he said. "It's not how you use my ship, and it's definitely not how you use her." He nodded once toward Lyra, who felt the gesture like a physical jolt. "Her. Not the cleaner. Not that girl. Her." Wren laughed harshly. "She's station labor." Elias answered, "She's a person." It was such a stupidly simple sentence that it might have broken her more deeply than poetry could have. For one suspended moment, Dock 47 seemed to lose all ambient noise. No crane groan, no announcement static, no neighboring hull pings. Only those words, landing in a life that had gone years without hearing herself defined so plainly, and without transaction. Ren, of course, recovered into bluster. There were threats, muttered citations, another round of fee escalation. Elias paid more than he should have, because even principled people sometimes buy time with currency when they know the structure is rotten from the base up. But he did not let Lyra board his hold under coerced labor, and when Ren stomped off cursing about humans and regulation sickness, something impossible had already happened. A man she had never met had interrupted the port's natural order on her behalf. That alone should have been enough to unsettle her into caution, and it did. Lyra avoided the pilot's gaze after that, returned to her solvent scraper, and told herself not to invent meaning where there was only momentary decency. She knew better than to build futures from passing kindness. Yet when Elias finished filing his docking clearance and began unloading his own crates rather than barking for station workers, he paused beside her on his second pass and set a sealed nutrition bar and a fresh pair of solvent gloves on the crate stack near her elbow, as if such gestures were no more notable than adjusting cargo weight. "Those fumes will strip your hands to bone," he said. "Use the gloves." Then he added, after a glance at the broken wrist brace she had tried to hide under her sleeve, "There's a med patch dispenser in my galley if you need it. No charge. I'm on station through morning." Lyra stared after him long after he was gone up the ramp. She did not follow him then. Hunger fought caution. Pride fought exhaustion. The old station reflex said every offered kindness eventually produced a cost. But something inside her, some tiny ruined thing that had once been a future-facing self before Port Serevan trained her to stare only downward, lifted its head. That was the beginning. Not rescue. Not love. Not immediate transformation. Just the dangerous reawakening of possibility in the life of an alien girl who had spent too long believing possibility was for other people. By the time the bay lights shifted to night cycle dim and the old human pilot's ship sat quiet under Dock 47's failing fluorescence, Lyra understood one terrible truth. She no longer wanted merely to endure tomorrow. She wanted to know what it might look like if she were allowed to belong to it. Chapter 2. A ship with room for one more soul. Lyra did not go to the Corvette that night. That detail mattered because stories often lie by making change seem instantaneous, as if one kind word should naturally cause a wounded life to leap toward trust. Real damage is less cooperative than that. She took the nutrition bar only after 3 full hours, and even then she opened it behind a cargo stack where no one could watch her eat. It was human-made, dense, slightly sweet, fortified with proteins and electrolytes better than anything station script usually bought, and the first bite hit her so unexpectedly that for a moment she had to close her eyes. Not because it was luxurious, because it was given without demand. The gloves she slipped on more slowly, testing the seams as if deceit might hide in the stitching. They fit. The med patch dispenser in the pilot's galley remained a temptation. She circled in thought, but did not approach. She had lived too long around men who understood that injured girls with no leverage, often confused, offered medicine for safety. Her caution was not cynicism. It was memory organized into instinct. Yet she thought about Elias all through the night cycle. She thought about the way he had looked at Ren, not with grand savior fury, but with a sort of practical refusal, as if the abuse of power in front of him had simply violated his internal maintenance standards. She thought about the sentence, "She's a person," and hated how deeply it had lodged. She thought about his ship, patched and unpretentious, and found herself imagining the inside of it with unreasonable precision. The smell of recycled air mixed with engine heat, the clutter of tools, the cramped galley he had mentioned, maybe a bunk with a blanket folded more carelessly than station regulations would allow. That imagination frightened her. People without futures survived by not decorating hope too quickly. Morning cycle on Port Serevan arrived the way it always did, with bad coffee steam in corridor vents, shift whistles distorted by old speakers, and labor rosters posted to public terminals where the unlucky pretended not to be relieved when their names still appeared. Lyra's did. Dock 47, secondary washdown, and outbound prep. She stood at the terminal long enough to feel disappointment before she understood what it meant. Some part of her had already hoped the human ship might be gone so she could preserve the encounter as a clean, isolated event, untangled by whatever came next. But the Corvette was still in bay. Worse or better, it looked even more alive in daylight. Panels were open along the engine flank. A service ladder hung loose from the ventral access port, and Elias himself was under the ship, half hidden by a diagnostic rig, cursing at something in a tone that suggested long acquaintance rather than true hostility. Lyra tried to keep her distance. For the first 2 hours, she worked the outer deck, hauling chemical lines, resealing waste canisters, and pretending the human presence on her bay did not produce a new constant awareness at the edge of thought. That plan failed when one of the upper grav crane joints seized and dropped a load shackle hard enough to shear the emergency brake housing. The entire line whined in mechanical distress. Workers scattered instinctively. Ren shouted uselessly from the booth. Lyra looked up and saw, with the sharp, unnatural clarity danger sometimes produces, the secondary carriage still moving along its track toward an unsecured cargo pallet where 2 younger cleaners were frozen in place, stunned by the noise. She moved before thinking. So did Elias. He came out from under the Corvette fast, wiping grease from one hand with the other, took one look at the failing crane line, and sprinted not away from the danger, but straight toward the manual control box mounted on the bay wall. Lyra reached the 2 girls first, shoved one clear, dragged the other by the shoulder harness, and hit the deck as the carriage bucked overhead. The crane should have dropped its load. Instead, the entire assembly locked with a screaming metallic jolt a meter above the floor. Silence followed, broken only by the ticking cool down of abused motors. Lyra lifted her head. Elias stood by the control box with one wrist jammed inside the open panel and sparks licking across the bay wall around him. He had manually bridged the brake circuit. Ren arrived red-faced and furious, not because anyone might have died, but because equipment failure meant paperwork. "Who authorized touching the control box?" he shouted. Elias pulled his arm free and shook feeling back into his hand. "Gravity did," he said. "You're welcome." Ren advanced, looking for the sort of confrontation men chose when they thought they still controlled the room. Then he saw the 2 half-crying cleaners Lyra had dragged out of the drop zone, saw the near-miss mark burned across the floor, and recalculated toward bluster instead of punishment. "This bay is a disaster because labor doesn't follow maintenance reporting," he snapped, already searching for someone weaker than himself to pin it on. His gaze landed, of course, on Lyra. You inspected this lane yesterday." The accusation hit with familiar inevitability. Dock laborers existed to absorb fault. Lyra opened her mouth, not to defend herself effectively. Defense rarely helped, but because something in her had changed enough to resist silence on reflex. She didn't get the chance. Elias stepped between them with the same matter-of-fact refusal he had shown the day before. "No," he said. "The brake housing failed because it hasn't been serviced in months and your seal logs are falsified." He lifted his grease-streaked hand and flicked a data strip toward Ren. "I copied the maintenance buffer when I overrode the panel. Want to keep yelling at the station cleaner? Or want to explain to port safety why your bay almost killed 3 people?" For a moment, Ren genuinely looked as if he might strike him. Instead, he snatched the strip, muttered a curse that seemed to include half the species in known space, and retreated to the booth to perform the administrative equivalent of hiding under a table. Around the bay, workers resumed breathing. One of the younger cleaners stared at Lyra with shocked gratitude. Another made the old protective gesture against bad luck. Elias, as if forcing dockmasters into paperwork corners were barely worth mention, turned back toward his ship. Then he glanced over his shoulder and asked Lyra, "You all right?" The absurdity of being asked nearly undid her. People asked whether she had finished, whether she had clocked, whether she had lost a chit, whether she could lift more than she looked like she could. They did not ask if she was all right. She nodded because words had become difficult. Later, when the bay settled into a nervous sort of normal, he found her alone near the waste recycler and handed her a small dermal patch from a sealed foil packet. "Your shoulder," he said. "You landed hard." She had. The joint was already stiffening. "I can't pay," she replied automatically. Elias frowned, as if the sentence itself irritated him. "It's a patch, not a mortgage." She almost smiled again, and this time the expression escaped before she could stop it. He saw it, but did not make a performance of having seen it. Instead, he leaned against the wall beside the recycler, gave the bay one assessing look, and said, "How long have you been on this station?" There were a dozen ways to answer that question badly. She chose the safest truth. Long enough. That bad. She looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. Long enough that bad stopped being surprising. Something tightened in his face, then not pity, which she would have hated, but recognition. As if he knew too much about places where suffering became routine paperwork. Their real conversation began that afternoon over a broken pressure cart. It had one jammed wheel and a warped coupling pin, which made it unsuited to hauling anything, but perfectly fit for giving two people a reason to stand near each other without making the station too curious. Elias was replacing the pin with a length of repurposed locking rod when Lyra, after hovering for almost a full minute in silent argument with herself, said, "You're not station contracted." "No." "Trade courier?" "Sometimes." "Smuggler?" He glanced up at that, and one side of his mouth lifted. Only morally. She should not have laughed. She did. The sound startled both of them. It came out rusty, brief, and far more intimate than any joke warranted. Elias returned his focus to the cart partly, she thought, to let her keep the dignity of not having been watched too closely while becoming briefly, embarrassingly human. "Used to fly military courier lanes," he said after a while. "Then used to fly diplomatic relief. Now I mostly take jobs that let me stay out of systems run by people who think documents make cruelty look respectable." The phrasing was so specific that Lyra felt herself studying him with new caution. "That sounds personal." He slid the repaired pin into place. "It is." She did not ask further then, but the answer mattered. It told her he was not merely a drifting nice man collecting passing virtues like souvenirs. There was history in him. Injury. Conviction with scar tissue around it. That made him feel paradoxically safer and more dangerous both. Safer because hollow charm rarely survives real grief. More dangerous because people with causes sometimes tried to recruit damaged strangers into their unfinished wars. As if hearing the thought, Elias sat back on his heels and said, "I'm not trying to fix your life, by the way." Lyra blinked. "What?" He shrugged. "You've been looking at me like you're waiting for the hidden cost. It's fair. Most costs are hidden until payments due. I'm just saying I am not here to play savior. I'm on station for one repair cycle, then I leave. You needed gloves. The dockmaster was being a parasite. The crane nearly killed you. Those are separate facts, not a recruitment strategy." The honesty of it hit her harder than any polished reassurance could have. "Then why keep helping?" she asked quietly. Elias tightened the last clamp on the pressure card and answered without looking up. "Because someone should." Again that sentence. Again that ruinous plainness. By the time evening cycle deepened across Dock 47, Lyra had learned more than she meant to. Elias had a ship called the Morrow Finch, 3 overdue refits, a taste in coffee so terrible it qualified as philosophical failure, and a habit of fixing any loose mechanism in arm's reach. He had seen the lower decks of too many stations like Serevan. He knew exactly what sort of place it was. He also knew, with unnerving accuracy, that she was considering asking a question and hated herself for considering it. So when the bay finally quieted and he was preparing to close his hull panels for departure at dawn, he looked at her standing uncertainly at the ramp base and said, "If you want out of here, ask directly." She went cold all at once. Hope, once named, becomes vulnerable to ridicule. "Out?" she repeated, "because buying time through stupidity is a universal survival habit." Elias nodded. Port Serevan. Dock 47. Station script. The whole charming arrangement. He rested one hand on the half-lowered ramp. "I've got room for one more crew body if that crew body doesn't mind hard work, bad sleep, and a ship that complains through every jump. Pay's real, though. Food's real, too. So is the danger. I can't promise some grand future. But I can promise this port stops being the only one you think exists." Lyra stared at him, unable for a heartbeat to move inside the size of what had just been offered. Not romance. Not rescue in the childish sense. A birth. Work. Exit velocity. The possibility of another horizon. "What would I do?" she asked finally. "Learn," he said. "Load. Patch. Route check. Keep me from flying us into a fuel receipt dispute. Maybe discover you're better at stars than mops." His voice softened just slightly. "Or decide after one run that you hate space and leave at a cleaner port. Choice is part of the deal. Choice. That was the word that nearly broke her. Lyra had forgotten how violently the soul can respond to the possibility of choice after years without it. She wanted to say yes immediately. She wanted to run. She wanted to accuse him of cruelty for making hope sound almost practical. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most to someone like her. Why me? Elias considered her for a long moment, and when he answered, there was no performance in it. Because you're still here, he said. A lot of people in your position stopped looking up. You didn't. That means there's still somewhere in you that expects more than this station has been willing to give. She did not answer right away. Could not. Behind them, Dock 47 flickered in failing light. All rust and noise and the small, exhausted miseries that had defined her life for too long. Ahead of her waited a patched human corvette and a pilot who refused to talk like futures were fairy tales. It was not safety. It was not certainty. It was, perhaps, the first real doorway she had seen in years. That night, for the first time since childhood, Lyra packed not because she was being moved by someone else's authority, but because she had decided to go. And in that decision, the alien girl who had believed she had no future took the first true step toward one.